Well, sweet. Welcome everyone to this Tech Threads interview with David Wang, who is currently the principal product manager at SeekOut. I've known David for a little bit, and he has had a lot of experience and helped me guide me kind of through product management and getting into it. And I wanted to ask David real quick if you could just give a quick introduction to yourself, kind of where you've been the last couple of years and kind of what you're working on.
Yeah, of course. Thanks again, Max. Really appreciate what you're doing here, really expanding and scaling the impact you're having and to others as you learn and grow as a product manager. My name is David. I'm a product manager at a startup called SeekOut. I think you already mentioned that. SeekOut is a talent intelligence platform that helps organizations find the talent that they need and grow the talent that they have. I'm pretty new to the company. I've been here maybe 4 months. In the past, I've also worked at Amazon and Qualtrics, and I actually transitioned into the tech industry after working for about 4 years in cancer research and deciding it wasn't the right career for me. So for anyone out there who's looking or interested in tech, I'm here to tell you it's possible. Just uh, take up the skills, learn, and there's a lot of opportunity out there to make a career transition.
That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't know previously that you were in cancer research, which is a really big, very studious, field. So it's pretty cool to see that you transitioned out of that into tech. Just to kind of give an overview of what I want to talk about today, I want to focus mainly on user research because that is a very big part of product managers, making sure their products, hit well with users. So they're always focusing on users and doing that research. I kind of want to talk a little bit about gathering user research, kind of some best practices, best methods to do that, and then kind of dive into using user research and just some of the common problems that PMs have when trying to decide what data to use, how to use the user research that they have. And then at the very end, if we have some time, I would love to dive into some kind of problems that common PMs have and just see what your thoughts are on them and see if you have any, with all of your experience, any ideas on how to kind of mitigate those problems. So just starting out with like gathering user research. I know I've taken some classes, and one of the biggest problems that a lot of students have is identifying who they need to research for their products. A lot of times that's like a really big problem that if you can get over it and find who you want to research, find your target audience and, your target persona and really nail that in, it really helps. So do you have any strategies or ways that when you're tackling some sort of problem or with a new product like at SeekOut, um, do you have any ways that you find the target audience or you like to find your, target persona?
Yeah, that's a great question. Finding target personas. So I think you touched on this a little earlier, but I look at uh, various UX research methods and who you're targeting. It's like a toolkit you kind of carry around, and you have to pick the right method and the right target audience based on the challenge you're facing. And what I've seen work well in the past is really start with the end goal you're trying to achieve, right? Define that very clearly. What does success look like? What are the questions you're trying to answer? And then based on that, you can pick the methodology that would most likely result in success. So uh, just an example, if you're trying to assess, customer satisfaction for a product, you probably want to use a survey that can get a wide range of responses. You want to be a little picky about, sampling, getting the right demographics, and it's not a biased sample. And you might lean into that more than interviews, right? Where it's not quite as scalable. You're getting feedback one-on-one with individual users, and you're not able to dedicate nearly as much time and get ultimately, the same number of data points. So, um, yeah, and as you're building this out, I think uh, circling back to your persona question, a
Mhm.
lot of this exercise is usually done in partnership with UX research teams, product marketing, and I like to create segments of personas that are really centered around what they're trying to accomplish, right, with your product, why
Right.
they would be using it, what are the needs and wants and desires, and their goals, and then try to get 3 to 5 different user personas that would help form the problems you're solving for and drive the product roadmap. And once you have that, you can actually use that to inform a lot of the research going forward as well.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that you said that kind of is another question I wanted to ask you. Like you said, when you're trying to gather these samples of people, you want to make sure there's no biases in the samples to kind of skew the data. And I'm sure there's actually a book that I read. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And it talks about all sorts of types of like user and just like human biases that we have. Is there like a technique that you have or a way that you help you and your other product managers on your team avoid biases in data that could kind of skew the results in the wrong way?
Yeah, that's a great question, Max. I think one thing to be aware of is you can never 100% avoid bias in your
Mhm.
research. There's always going
Right.
to be some, right? So knowing that, you can and should still be intentional about reducing bias whenever possible. Or another thing is if it's not possible, explicitly call out how a study, might be potentially biased.
Mm,
Um, that way, people reading the results at least are aware of it. So a um, couple principles I think that come to mind, right? Be intentional about sampling. We touched on this. Try to get as large
right.
and representative of a sample size as you can. So it's not always, just get a lot of users, but make sure the users you're either surveying or interviewing are actually the ones that will be using the product, right? And
Right.
the different channels you're capturing. For example, um, like user reviews, usually you're going to get kind of the opposite ends, people who love your product or hate it. And then just knowing that you're probably going to miss a lot of the middle section where people are just using your product. It's fine. It's not life changing, but you're not going to get a lot of people giving, 3 out of 5 stars typically.
Right.
When you're asking questions, either in your survey or your interviews, how are you creating the questions? Um, don't ask anything leading, right? Ask open-ended questions so users have a chance to actually respond with what they're thinking.
Right.
And I also like doing A/B testing whenever possible, right? Including a control group that you're actually comparing against a treatment group. That's like one of the easiest ways to actually show if something you're doing is having an impact. Did a lot of that back in the cancer research days, and it's I think much less controlled and messier in tech because you're trying to move fast and you might not always have the time to control for every variable, but it's still a really powerful tool.
Right. And that's actually really funny that you take what you've learned in your cancer research or like any other industry, for example, and pivot it into a product management perspective. I think, what you've learned in the past in other industries definitely relates to product management. And for a lot of people out there, I think what they've learned either in school or in their other types of fields or jobs that they have can transition to product management. Um,
Yeah. Actually, one thing I
yeah,
want to call out,
definitely.
one more thing about bias. I think it's important to realize that one of the biggest sources of bias will inevitably be yourself. And a common
Mhm.
mistake I see happen is, uh, product managers going out and trying to do research to validate their own assumptions rather than to learn from the user, right? So, like if you're like bad PMs, what they do is they go into interviews trying to fish for
Mm,
compliments about their product, and
right.
they believe that success comes from like trying to convince a user that their product is great. And it's like you have to buy this. This is awesome. They're almost like being salesy about it, but
Mhm.
actually, what I've seen the greatest PMs that I've learned from, they go into interviews wanting to learn as much as possible about the user, right? The
Yep.
good, the bad, the ugly, and anything that can help inform where their feature can improve, where it's missing the mark, and where it can better serve the users. So that's a really important principle to keep in mind. It's, don't go in with the attitude of I'm trying to sell the product, but rather just learn from your users and avoid the bias of just trying to validate my own assumptions.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something too. I had this product development class where we started out doing user research, and our teacher said, "Okay, we're going to start out. What do you think the first thing we need to do?" And a lot of people like raise their hand and be like, "Oh, we got to have our idea. We got to have our solution to the problem." And she was like, "No, that's wrong." And she showed us this diagram that had two triangles. And at the very first triangle was understanding your user, and at the very end of the diagram is where you actually, have your idea of how you're going to solve it. But that only comes after, like you said, you go into these studies and this user research trying to figure out more about your user without trying to validate some idea that you had in the past before even talking to them. So I think that's a really good point to point out, to just avoid bias. And kind of, I mean, as a piano, I'm sure your life is chaotic. It's super busy. You always have something you have to be doing. When does it come to the point where you are like doing user research or you've gained user research? How do you know when you have enough or that you're confident that the user research you have is enough to make like a big decision that will lead the product in its, whatever direction that you're trying to lead it in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think the best description I've heard about user research was from an awesome UX research manager I worked with back in Qualtrics. And what she said was the point of user research is to de-risk decision making, right?
Mhm.
And as you mentioned just a second ago, product managers have to make a huge number of decisions every day, right? Some
Right.
are really big, like what's on the 3-year roadmap? What features do we build next? All the way down to small decisions like how do we build it? Do we put a button here? What color do we build? How do we improve the experience? So the user research, I think, helps the entire team make decisions with more confidence about what's on the other side. And to circle back to your question about how do you know when it's enough, that's just as much of an art as it is a science.
Right.
At Amazon, we actually have a way of thinking about decision making. I don't know if you've heard of one and two-way doors, right? So if something is a one-way door, that's a decision. The door closes and locks behind you. You can only go one direction. That means if you make the decision, it's really hard to reverse, right? Or impossible, and you
Mhm.
can't roll it back. So whatever's on the other side, you better be pretty darn confident that you want to go through this door. Then there's other things that are two-way doors where, you know what, you make a decision, you go over, you open the door, you don't like what's on the other side, it's easy to go back, right?
Mhm.
So um, actually at Amazon, they encouraged us to be pretty quick. A lot of times, even in the lack of data, just go with intuition and move fast for two-way doors because they're easy to reverse. But anything that's a one-way door, make sure you have a lot more data and confidence and conviction before you cross into those type of decisions.
Right. I think I actually I read the book Working Backwards, which is an Amazon book that talks just about that. So I've heard that analogy before of the one way and the two-way doors. And another thing that I think is really fun with product management and user research is it is very iterative. It's very agile. You're constantly, coming with some idea, going out, doing user research and then like changing your idea based on what the research says and what the users really want. And so I think that's a very good point about the two-way doors, if it's something you can reverse, like, yeah, do it sloppy and quick and then get your data and then see if it actually is and then put more time into it. But if it's a one-way door, you better be really sure about that decision and that it's backed by the data that, you've gathered and you want to gather. Um, with that, talking kind of about more about using user research, because I know a lot of times people get faced like with very ambiguous data. Like, for example, say you send out a survey full of multiple questions and you get the research back. Do you have any way or strategy and when you do receive kind of ambiguous, you know, maybe not certain data on how you kind of decipher it to kind of get some story or some meaning from that data?
That's an interesting question. I think what I've learned through a lot of trial and error is that if you set up the if you do the pre-work to set up research correctly, it will very rarely lead to ambiguous outcomes.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, for everything I'm doing, if I'm researching it, I try to generate a research plan, right? That starts with the goal of the research, a clear definition of like what are the decisions we're trying to make, and then it outlines a strategy for getting data points that we want, right? All the way down to like the questions we're asking, or um, how whether we're surveying, interviewing, doing product walkthroughs with users, and partnering in this way with the UX team. I think uh, we're able to generate a plan where there's almost no middle ground, right? Like
Mhm.
no matter how the user answers, I think if you structure your plan correctly, it will it's a you should be able to point one way or the other. depending on the decision you're trying to make.
Right.
Um, but if you do get ambiguous data, I don't know, how have I handled that in the past? I guess it depends on what is the question you're trying to answer and what went wrong. That's a
Yeah.
little bit tough to answer without a little more detail.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you said was great. I mean, if you do the pre-work, if you structure your questions right, your research right, you shouldn't have ambiguous data. It should be very clear, like, oh, it says yes or no, this or that, or like this is what they're saying. So I definitely think that's like a big key to avoiding ambiguous data is just, structuring it the right way before you even start. Um, Another question kind of along using user research. I know there are some opinions about this, floating around on the internet about when you should do user research. Do you have any advice for someone of like at what cadence you should be doing user research? Like, all at the beginning, get your research and, develop that feature or product, or do you, space it out and like kind of have this constant continual user research flow going on? Do you have any like opinions on that and kind of what you think would be is best for people developing products?
That's a good question. I can tell you what I personally think, but there's always caveats, right? I love to
Right.
always be checking in with users, right? So um, at Qualtrics, we had a super well-funded UX research team. So I was always running like foundational research, better understand, like answering really big questions about our users. And hopefully this feeds into, new product innovation and ideas. So I'm always kind of running some of this in the background, and we're planning to run the next cycle. And this is, bigger picture stuff. It takes a couple months, a lot of users, and a dedicated researcher to run the experiments and then synthesize the data. Then,
Mhm.
as you're building products, right? I like to constantly check in. So you have a prototype. Let's test it with some users, right? Before you even build it out and figure out how we can make it a little more impactful. After you launch it, you analyze, um, a lot of the metrics, like combine quantitative and qualitative data, um, and find the users that where it's not working, right? Where they tried your product and then stopped using it, right? I like to reach out and say, "Oh, what was your experience? Why haven't you used it?" Figure out the gaps. So the kind of the entire product life cycle, as much as possible. I personally like to check in with users, but ultimately it's going to be constrained based on how much time you have, how much, resource and funding and support you have from your UX research team. So at SeekOut, we're a startup, we're a lot more scrappy. We don't have a hugely funded UX research team, right? We have a couple designers that split their time actually designing product and doing research. So we have to be a lot more scrappy,
Mhm.
um, or just move quicker and sometimes just use our best guess for stuff. So a lot of it will be dependent on the constraints you're working with, but as much as possible, I like to be always checking in, making sure our product is landing well with our customers and our users.
Right. I mean, that makes total sense. You don't want to go too deep into some hole without getting user research back to kind of, validate what you're actually building would be worth it. Just kind of as we wrap up, do you have any other, advice, anything that was like life changing to you that comes to user research that you'd like to share with everyone?
I don't know if it's anything life changing, but we already touched on a good definition of user research is to help de-risk the decisions you make. I think that was a real light bulb moment for me. Like, what's the purpose of it? Um, I think just from Amazon, right? They really stress customer obsession. And it
Mhm.
was just a really good environment to learn about how a customer obsessed company operates. Because you'd be surprised how many organizations out there are building products with very minimal user research and validation.
Right.
and seeing the opposite, and when it's done really well, like how successful it can make a company. So no matter where I go, I even when I join a new company, I want to know what research has been out there, where are the gaps in our understanding, how do we plug a lot of that? And then maybe as a last point is it's important to combine both quantitative and qualitative data, right? Because both
Hmm.
have their place in understanding users. So quantitative data from surveys, from tracking how users are interacting with your product, it kind of provides a really unbiased picture of what's happening with your product, right? So
Right.
it can validate assumptions. You can't force users to click on certain things. It's just reality of what happens. But a lot of times quantitative data doesn't answer the why behind why users are actually doing that. So it must be combined with qualitative research and interviews and product walkthroughs to form this complete picture that you can really take back and have a lot of confidence in what to do next.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's a great way to end it. That's just a kind of a full circle on why we do user research, why it's important. But David, I just wanted to thank you again so much for taking the time to hop on this. What you shared was amazing, and I'm sure a lot of people will find value in it. And I really appreciate your expertise. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for asking, Max. Good luck with everything.
Yep. You too.